All right, we're going to start the next chapter, and actually it's 4 chapters, and they all pertain to the nervous system. It is a really complex system. It covers 4 chapters in OpenStax because it is got so many different parts and pieces to it. We've got the brain, the spinal cord, we've got the peripheral nerves, and so these chapters cover all of that. We're not going to go through every part of each of those chapters, but I'm going to try to give you a good general overview of the function of the nervous system, the structure of the nervous system, and how it all integrates the rest of the body in order to cause an integration of allowing our body to do things. It controls all of our muscles and it controls our glands, okay? And those are the things that allow our bodies to respond to stimuli in our environment, okay? And that's pretty much what the nervous system does. It is an important system in terms of it's going to gather information from our environment through sensory input. And that sensory input comes from all of the parts of our body that can gather information from our environment. Our eyes, our ears in terms of being able to hear things, our nose in terms of being able to smell things, our mouth in order to be able to taste things, our skin that can detect pain, pressure, temperature. All of that information is gathered from our environment and it is sent to our nervous system where it is integrated. Okay, and our nervous system decides what to do with it. Is it going to require an action? Is it because you've put your hand down on a hot plate and it's going to require your hand to be pulled away so that you don't burn yourself? Is it you've tasted something that tastes really bad and it's doesn't sit well with you? You want to get rid of it out of your mouth because it tastes terrible. Is it something about somebody's chasing you and you better start running, like maybe a big German Shepherd is chasing you and you feel scared and so you feel the need to run away. And so all of that information is processed through the nervous system so that you can kind of have a response to whatever information that you have gathered from your environment. And we call that a motor output. And all of that, so sensory input, gathering information from our environment, deciding what to do with that information, and then having a response to that information is all what our nervous system does, okay? So it's a pretty complicated, complex system that allows us, really, it's kind of our central processing system of the entire body, because really without our nervous system, none of the other 10 body systems would work, okay? So this is the system that kind of puts everything together and allows us to respond to stimuli in a way that ensures that our body is not hurt. Our body is functioning properly in terms of maybe digesting food. Our hormones are in balance so that we can reproduce. So it's that system that puts everything together so that we can maintain homeostasis on a daily basis. Okay, and this is kind of just a schematic on just a summary of what the nervous system does. So you're getting some kind of sensory receptor, so eyes, ears, nose, mouth, taste, your skin in terms of touch, cold, temperature, pressure, things like that. So you're getting that information. It is getting integrated through the brain and spinal cord, and then your brain and spinal cord are going to decide what to do with that information, and then you're going to have some kind of motor output, which is what we call through an effector. And effectors are muscle and glands in the body, okay? Now, the nervous system is kind of classified in 2 ways. We can classify the nervous system in a structural classification, which is just based on the structures. So we've got a central nervous system, which our central nervous system is our brain. Is our brain. I'm trying to get my pen to work. Come on. Okay, so our central nervous system is made up of our brain and our spinal cord. Those 2 parts are our central nervous system. So structurally, those are the 2 structures that make up our central nervous system. Our peripheral nervous system is made up of all the nerves that come off of our brain and spinal cord. So when you think of like sciatic nerve, ulnar nerve, we've talked about the ulnar nerve, that's the one that you hit the inside of your elbow and it sends that kind of shock down your arm. So that, those are nerves. So anything that comes off of the brain and spinal cord are what we call the peripheral nerves, and that makes up what we call our peripheral nervous system. And our peripheral nerves are made up of spinal nerves. So we've got spinal nerves, and we have something called cranial nerves. Spinal nerves come off of the brain, and spinal nerves come off the spinal cord. Cranial nerves come off of the brain. It's supposed to be nerves, so I'm just going to put a little sign there, nerves, okay? We have 31 spinal nerves, and we have 12 cranial nerves, okay? So spinal nerves come off of the spine, cranial nerves come off of the brain, okay? And those make up the peripheral nervous system, okay? Now, that's structural. So now we also have a functional classification. This is based on activities, okay? We have something called the sensory division, and it's called, or also called the afferent division. We have something called the motor division, called the efferent division. And if we go back to this picture right here, you can see this is where sensory, so this would be our sensory system, okay, or our afferent. So if I go back and write in so sensory would be what we would call our afferent, and then motor would be what we call our efferent. So afferent brings signals in, so you're bringing signals in. Afferent, our signals are exiting. So think of like the E. Their signals are coming out of the spinal cord or in the brain. They're coming out of the central nervous system. So afferent carries things to the central nervous system. Efferent carries things away from the central nervous system. Okay, so your sensory afferent division is going to the central nervous system. So we'll put to CNS, to central nervous system. Motor division is coming from central nervous system. Okay, so you got to input your signal, and then a signal is going to be generated in the central nervous system, and then it's going to exit from the central nervous system, and it's going to go to the motor division. And the motor division is made up of muscle and glands. Okay? So we've got, like I said, we've got our structural classification, and we've got the activities classification, or our functional classification. Okay, so structural, functional. One is made up of the structures: central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. Central's brain and spinal cord. Peripheral are all the nerves that come off of the central nervous system. Functional, in terms of the activities that it's generated, we've got sensory, which are signals that go to the central nervous system. They're going to get processed in the central nervous system, and they're going to generate some kind of response, and that response then is transmitted to muscle and glands through what we call the efferent division. And here's kind of a nice picture too in terms of how we kind of put it all together. Okay, so central nervous system is your brain and spinal cord. Okay, the peripheral nervous system is made up of our cranial and spinal nerves. Okay, and you can kind of see here too. Okay, so all of our sensory information, okay, so our sense organs, the sense organs are going to be, you know, our eyes, our ears, our nose, our mouth, okay, and then our skin, okay. They are going to bring information from the environment. It's going to go to what we call our sensory nervous system. That is going to go to the central nervous system, okay, ultimately going to the central nervous system. So first it gets processed in our, it gets transported there through our cranial and spinal nerves. Okay, ultimately it goes to the central nervous system. Here it's some kind of, you know, generation is going to happen of what the response is going to be. Okay, and then it's going to go out of the brain and spinal cord to our peripheral nervous system, and then it's going to go to our motor, which is going to be muscles and glands. Okay, where some kind of response is going to happen. Okay, all right, so it's going in, processed, and coming out. Now, what's really interesting about our motor, or what we call our efferent nervous system, is that there's actually two divisions of it. When we say muscles and glands, do you remember muscles? We had skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. And remember, skeletal was the only one of the muscles that were consciously controlled, and that is what we call the somatic nervous system, because that's skeletal muscle. Okay, the other part of the motor or efferent nervous system is what's under involuntary control. That's going to be your cardiac, your smooth muscles, and then also your glands. You can't control your pancreas, you can't control your thyroid gland, you can't control your hypothalamus or your pituitary gland. Those are all under autonomic nervous control, meaning that your body just does it for you. Okay, it's under what we call self-control. The only one that we can consciously control are our skeletal muscles, because they're voluntary, and that's what we call the somatic nervous system, okay? So there's some different divisions here depending on whether you can control it consciously or not, okay? And what's really interesting, our autonomic nervous system, which is involuntary, is also under what we have the parasympathetic nervous system and sympathetic nervous system. We can actually divide it down into two. These are what we call our fight and flight. You ever heard that term, nervous systems? Your sympathetic is called your fight and flight, okay? Meaning that your sympathetic takes over when you're scared, when you are stressed, something like that, okay? Your parasympathetic takes over, and it's what we call your rest and digest. When you are calm and not in any kind of stress, okay, your parasympathetic nervous system takes over. And this is when you do your resting and your digesting of food, okay? When you're stressed, that German Shepherd's running after you, your sympathetic nervous system overtakes, and that's your fight and flight, okay? They are actually antagonistic to each other. For example, if your parasympathetic nervous system lowers your blood pressure, sympathetic can raise your blood pressure. If your parasympathetic can lower your heart rate, sympathetic is going to raise your heart rate. Okay, so they're actually antagonistic of each other. They do opposite effects of each other. So one is used during rest and digest, and one is used during stress or fight, what we call fight or flight. Okay, and we'll talk more about those, you know, as we go through the nervous system. Okay, all right, so central nervous system, like I said, it's your brain and spinal cord, okay? Those are the organs that make up your central nervous system. The function is to integrate, it's kind of the command center of your body. It interprets any kind of incoming sensory information. So information you get from your eyes, your nose, your ears, your mouth, your skin. It interprets that, and then it's going to output instructions, what to do with that sensory information. And it could be do nothing with it, okay? There's nothing that needs to be done. There's nothing, you don't see anything that's stressful. You don't hear anything, you know, that you need, maybe something's too loud and you want to cover your ears, you know, so some responses, you know, you might not do anything with. Your brain decides what to do with the information. Does it require a response or does it not require a response? If it requires a response, it's because your body needs to change something, okay? Whether it, like I said, pulling your hand away from a hot stove or getting out of a situation that could be dangerous to your body, okay? And your brain is able to interpret that information, okay? And then it's going to send out an instruction for you what to do, okay? So that's your central nervous system, all right? Your peripheral nervous system, like I said, is anything that kind of comes off of your brain and spinal cord. So these are nerves that come off of your brain and spinal cord. So spinal nerves come off of your spine. And like I said, there are 31 pairs of them because you have one on each side. One comes off your right part of your spine, one comes off the left. So there's 31 pairs of what we call spinal nerves. Okay. Gosh, my handwriting's terrible. Cranial nerves, they come off of the brain, and there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, okay? An example of a cranial nerve is like your optic nerve. Your optic nerve is cranial nerve number 2. This is the nerve that allows you to see. Cranial nerve number 1 is your olfactory nerve, and they're often given Roman numerals, and we'll talk about the cranial nerves. Your olfactory nerve is the one that allows you to smell, and that's actually cranial nerve number 1, okay? All 12 cranial nerves are given numbers, and you do have to learn all 12, but your optic nerve is number 2. This allows you to see. Olfactory allows you to smell, and we'll talk about other types of cranial nerves when we get to the peripheral nervous system, okay? The functions of your peripheral nervous system, they serve as communication lines among sensory organs, the brain and spinal cord, and glands, okay? So these are the ones that are going to take inputs, be able to send them to the brain and spinal cord, and then also have an output in terms of what to do with that information, okay? They're kind of the communication link between the outside sensory information and then getting it to your brain and spinal cord, okay? And here's kind of a nice, I like this picture, okay? So you can see your central nervous system, it's your brain and spinal cord, okay? And remember, the brain and spinal cord are found in the dorsal body cavity, okay? Remember, your brain sits in the cranial cavity, and your spinal cord sits in the vertebral cavity. Okay, all right? And then coming off of that, you've got your cranial nerves, which there are 12. Your spinal nerves, there are 31. And you can see all of these that are kind of coming off are what we call your spinal nerves, okay? And so you can see here's like your large sciatic nerves coming off. You've got a femoral nerve coming off. You know, here's your ulnar nerve coming off here, okay? And we'll learn some of these peripheral nerves. You don't have to learn all of them. There's tons of them, but you don't have to learn, but you're going to learn a few of them, some of the main ones, okay? You also have something here interesting called a ganglia, okay? A ganglia is an interesting structure. You can see it comes off of here, the peripheral nervous system. It's this little bulb-like structure right here, okay? What is found in a ganglia are cell bodies. And we'll talk about these, what this structure is. I just wanted to kind of point this out to you now. If you remember a nerve cell kind of looks like this. And we looked at this, and like we talked about nervous tissue way back in chapter like 4. Remember, there's a cell body, okay, and here's the axon, and we talked about this in nerve, and here's the axon terminal. Axon terminal, okay. This is the cell body. This is where the nucleus is going to be found, okay. A ganglion is a cluster of cell bodies. So a whole bunch of these nerve cells, their little cell bodies are all clustered in this little thing called a ganglia. Okay, and so the little cell bodies are there, and then all the little axons extend out from the ganglia. Okay, and we'll talk more about what a ganglia is in a little bit. I just wanted to kind of show you that because it's on this diagram, and you can see there are these little bulbous structures that are coming off here of these peripheral nerves, but what's found in there are just cell bodies. This structure, a whole group cluster of them are kind of found here, okay, and that's what it is. I just wanted to point that out to you since it's on the little diagram, okay. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, so now, so let's talk a little bit. So we just talked a little bit about structural classification. So let's talk a little bit about now functional, okay? So remember, there's 2 functional classifications of the nervous system. There's the sensory or the afferent. This means coming in, okay? So in, okay? Then we have what we call the efferent. This is exiting. So you've got to bring information in from the environment, process it, and then you have to have some kind of response going out, okay? And so that's kind of the functional classification of the nervous system, is bringing information in, processing it, and then having some kind of response exiting from the nervous system. And that's the functional classification of the nervous system, okay? So sensory nervous is, you know, nerve fibers that carry information to the central nervous system, okay? You have the somatic sensory, or what we call the afferent fibers that carry information from the skin and the skeletal muscles and joints, okay? Then we have something called visceral, okay? Visceral has to do with, visceral just means internal organs, okay? So all of the internal organs, okay, maybe that your stomach is growling and because it's hungry, you're thinking of food. Any kind of information that's coming from visceral organs or internal organs, okay? That is what we call visceral sensory fibers that carry information from visceral organs. So you've got to have information that's coming from, you know, your skin, your skeletal muscles and joints, okay? And then also from all your internal organs, okay? They're going to carry all that information to the central nervous system. Your central nervous system is going to process it, and then it's going to have some kind of impulse that's going to decide what to do. And this is going to carry it away from the central nervous system, or it's going to exit the central nervous system, okay? So I always like to kind of think of efferent as exiting. So nerve fibers that carry impulses away from the central nervous system to organs, to effector organs. So that can be muscles and glands. And muscles, you know, like I said, it can be skeletal muscles, or it can be cardiac, smooth, and then obviously glands, okay? And that's going to make up what we call your motor division, or your efferent division. Okay, so let's take, So we did that. Okay, let's take a look at this one. Okay, so there's two divisions of your, what we call your motor division. Okay, so you've got your somatic nervous system, which is voluntary. Okay, this is the one that you can consciously control, and it has to do with skeletal muscles. And we've talked about this a lot because we just finished all the skeletal muscles. So this is going to control skeletal muscles, and because remember, they're voluntary. Okay, of the three muscle types, skeletal muscle is the only one that is voluntary. Okay. So that's called our somatic nervous system. Okay, so it's a division of the motor nervous system. So we take our motor nervous system, we can divide it into two. The somatic, which is voluntary, and then we have something called the autonomic. Auto means self, so it's self-regulating. It is involuntary. We cannot control our autonomic nervous system. It does it for us. And thank goodness, because this is what controls, our heart beating. So that we don't have to think about our heart beating. It controls all the smooth muscles that make up, all those hollow internal organs, our stomach, our small intestines, our large intestines, our esophagus. All of that is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Same thing with our cardiac muscle, okay, that can control our heartbeat, okay. Although the heart is self-regulating, although it can be influenced by the autonomic nervous system too, okay. And we'll talk about that when we get to cardiac tissue. We talk about the heart, okay. That's next semester. Now, further divided into what we call the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And I kind of already mentioned that sympathetic is fight or flight. This is under stressful situations. So think about the S for sympathetic, stress, okay? Parasympathetic is more kind of rest. When you're calm, you're not stressed, you're not, you don't see anything stressful, you're not feeling anxious, you're not being chased by a German Shepherd, you're sitting in your bed studying and you're resting. This allows you to kind of rest and digest your food. That's parasympathetic. They are antagonists to each other, okay? Because the parasympathetic can do one thing, the opposite is going to be the sympathetic. So maybe parasympathetic will lower your blood pressure, sympathetic will raise your blood pressure, okay? So they can do opposite effects of each other. Okay. All right, now let's talk a little bit about nervous tissue. So we talked a little bit about function. So let's talk a little bit about structure in terms of nervous tissue. Okay, and we've looked at these already back in chapter 4. That was probably September, so we've got to have a little refresher. Okay. Nervous tissue is composed of two types of cells. So when we look at the nervous system, it's really made up of two types of cells. Okay. The first one are the neurons, which are really, if you remember, I used the analogy of NASCAR. Okay, neurons are kind of like the driver and the car, okay? All right, they're kind of the main cell, all right? The supporting cells, okay, so this would be like the pit crew. Okay, so this is the guy that changes the tires and puts a gas in the car and gets the driver water and makes sure that the car is running correctly, like the pit crew of NASCAR. That's what we call neuroglial cells, okay? Neuroglial cells outnumber neurons probably 100 to 1. There are a lot more neuroglial cells than there are neurons, but neurons are kind of the main component of nervous tissue in terms of they're the functioning unit of nervous tissue. Neuroglial are just kind of supporting cells, okay? They make sure that neurons function properly, okay? That's why I like kind of using the NASCAR analogy, because the driver and the car are kind of your neurons, and then everything that supports the neurons is kind of like the pit crew, okay? So let's talk a little bit about the pit crew first. Let's talk a little bit about the neuroglial cells first, because there's a lot of different types of neuroglial cells, so let's talk a little bit about what they do, okay? So support cells in the central nervous system are grouped together as what we call neuroglia. It's just a general term for the cells that support neurons, okay? Their functions are really to support neurons, insulate them, and protect them. When I say protect them, I mean by protecting them from, we have cells called microglial cells that can protect them from bacteria, viruses, things that should not be there, okay? They're kind of the guardians of the nervous system, okay? There are special cells that insulate nerve cells to help transmit electrical impulses faster. It's kind of like insulating a wire. And there are cells that support them, okay? There are cells called astrocytes that make sure that neurons have all the things that they need, all the neurons, or all the ions that they need, all the glucose that they need, all the water, sodium, potassium, anything that they need. There is a cell that does it. They're called astrocytes, and they call them astrocytes because they look like stars, like an astro, meaning like star-like, okay? Okay, so nervous tissues, let me go, I'm sorry. Okay, so nervous tissue is made up of two principal cell types, okay? So like I said, you've got your supporting cells, which we call neuroglial cells, okay? And then you've got your neurons, okay? So this nervous tissue are made up of these support, like I said, probably 100 to 1. There's probably 100 neuroglial cells to every one neuron, okay? Some of them resemble neurons, okay? But they are not able to conduct a nerve impulse, okay? They are not electrically stimulated like neurons are. And they never lose their ability to divide. Okay, neurons do lose their ability to divide. Okay, but neuroglial cells can undergo mitosis, whereas neurons cannot. Okay, so they can continually undergo mitosis where they can divide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about these cells. Sorry, my pen is not wanting to act. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about these supporting cells. Okay. So central nervous system glial cells. First one, let's look at the astrocytes, okay? And they're called astrocytes because they're star-shaped, okay? Astro meaning star, cyte means cell, so they're star-shaped cells. They're really, really interesting cells because they help to kind of brace and anchor neurons to blood capillaries, okay? If you look at this picture, you can kind of see this red structure right here is a capillary, okay? It is where blood is found, okay? So blood kind of flows through here. And, you know, within blood is going to be where you're going to have glucose and ions, okay, and all the things that nerve cells might need, okay? And astrocytes are the ones that can take those nutrients from capillaries and they get transported to the nerve, okay, to the neuron, okay? So they help to regulate nutrients that kind of go from a capillary into a neuron, and it regulates really important. It's called the blood-brain barrier, because anything that's in the capillary that the neuron doesn't need, this guy's kind of the gatekeeper. Make sure that it only provides the neurons with things it needs. Okay, so glucose, any kind of ion it might need, water, things like that. Anything that the neuron doesn't need is not does not get transported into the neuron, and it has to go through this astrocyte. So these guys are really important in terms of like the gatekeepers. Okay, they determine the permeability and exchanges between blood capillaries and neurons. So they're the exchangers. Whatever the neuron needs, it will get it from the capillary. Whatever the neuron doesn't need, it keeps it in the capillary. Okay, it protects the neurons from harmful substances in the blood, alcohol, toxins, microorganisms. Okay, it makes sure those things don't come in contact with the neuron. So these guys are the protectors, really, really important structures. Okay, they control the chemical environment of the brain. Okay, so they can detect if there's too much potassium, if there's not enough sodium, if there's not enough glucose. Okay, they can regulate those kinds of ions, and they make sure that they keep the chemical environment found within the brain, within these neurons, at the right level. Okay, so they maintain the homeostasis of these cells. And you can kind of see them here, they're really cool. They're kind of these star-looking cells. You can see here is a nerve cell here. Okay, this looks like maybe either a dendrite or maybe an axon. Okay, and they help to shunt anything from a blood capillary, okay, to the actual nerve. Okay, so a really important cell. Really interesting looking cell. Okay, the next one's called a microglial cell. These guys are they're kind of the immune system found within nervous tissue. They are spider-like. There you can kind of see them here. They almost look like little osteocytes. Okay, they're kind of spider-like looking cells. They are phagocytes. Okay, and if you can remember what a phagocyte is, okay, it can engulf foreign material. So anything that should not be there, a bacteria, a virus, anything that shouldn't be there, these guys what they can do, so let's say here's the little bacteria, this guy can kind of surround it with its cell membrane, and then eventually it can engulf it, where then it will destroy it. Okay, so it kind of surrounds it. That's what phagocytosis is. It takes its cell membrane, it surrounds it, and then eventually it will engulf it and take it in, and then it'll fuse with like a lysosome and get destroyed. Okay, so it disposes of any kind of debris that's found there. All right, so these are microglial cells. They also look very, very star-like. They've got these long extensions, and they just monitor the environment that surrounds neurons, make sure that there's nothing there that shouldn't be, like I said, viruses, bacteria, things like that. Okay? The next one are called ependymal cells. Ependymal cells are really cool looking cells too. They almost look like pseudostratified epithelial cells. They are found in the brain and spinal cord. They help to secrete and circulate cerebrospinal fluid, and we call that CNS. CBS, cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, they are these cells. You can kind of see them here. They have really large nuclei, but they also have this cilia on them, and so they will secrete cerebrospinal fluid that circulates. It kind of bathes the brain and spinal cord. It's a fluid so that the brain kind of floats in the cranial cavity, because if it did not float, it would crush the brainstem. Okay, so it allows it to kind of float in this watery-like substance called cerebrospinal fluid. If you've ever had a spinal tap, that's what they're pulling out. They're pulling out cerebrospinal fluid, and they're probably looking for things like bacteria, viruses that shouldn't be in there. But they pull it out of your spinal cord because cerebrospinal fluid circulates around your brain and your spinal cord. Okay, and these ependymal cells allow that to keep, because cerebrospinal fluid also helps to pull things, waste products and so forth, away from the brain. And so it's constantly circulated around the brain and spinal cord. But these are what we call these little ependymal cells. Okay, so here it would be like brain and spinal tissue. And they line brain and spinal tissue. And like I said, they will secrete cerebrospinal fluid, and they allow it to kind of float around inside the cranial and vertebral cavities. Okay, but that's what ependymal cells do. All right, the next one are really interesting cells. Okay, these cells are called oligodendrocytes. Okay, oligodendrocytes are interesting cells because they wrap fat, or what we call myelin sheath, around nerve fibers, around the axons. Okay, and so you can kind of see here's the nucleus, and they wrap these. It looks like a jelly roll almost, but they are called myelin sheaths. They're made up of fat, and they help to insulate nerve fibers. And what this insulation helps do is to help transmit nerve impulses much faster. Okay, it's like insulating. If you've ever seen like a wire, an electrical wire, they insulate it in plastic. Okay, and so it helps to transmit electrical signals faster. Okay, because remember, that's what nerve cells do. They communicate through electrical signals. Okay, and so it helps to be able to transmit these signals faster when they're insulated. Okay, and this is what oligodendrocytes do. They wrap around nerve fibers in the central nervous system, and they produce what we call myelin sheaths. Okay, and it plays a role in a nerve impulse transmission. Okay, all right. So all of those are found in the central nervous system. We have a couple of supporting cells in the peripheral nervous system. So in your notes, make sure that you circle this, because the 4 that I just talked about are found in the central nervous system. These 2 here, Schwann cells and satellite cells, are found in the peripheral nervous system. Okay. We have something called a Schwann cell. Schwann cell is very similar to the astrocytes. Okay, they are found. I'm sorry, Schwann cells are very similar to the oligodendrocytes. They are the ones that make up the myelin sheath. Okay, but they're found in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, satellite cells are very similar to the astrocytes, and here you can see the satellite cells. They surround usually the cell bodies of the neuron that are found in peripheral nervous system, and they provide nourishment, protection, things like that. And so satellite cells are very similar to like astrocytes. Okay, but these are the 2 types of cells, neuroglial cells, that are found in the peripheral nervous system. Okay. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about neurons now, the actual nerve tissue or nerve cells. Okay, these are specialized cells that can transmit messages, and these are called nerve impulses. Okay, and we've talked about this already in terms of muscles. Nerve impulses are transmitted as action potentials. Okay, they are major regions of all the neurons. So we've got 2 things: we've got the cell body, and we've got the processes that come off of them. Okay, and so the cell body's got the nucleus. It's where all the metabolic machinery of the cell is going to be located, the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi, the ribosomes, all of that is going to be found in the cell body. Okay, so that's where the nucleus is found. Then you've got processes that kind of hang off of the cell body, and they extend from the cell body. So you've got something called dendrites, and you've got something called an axon. Okay, and like I said, we've already talked about those a little bit already. Okay, so you can see here is the cell body is the metabolic center. Okay, it's got the nucleus with a large nucleolus. Okay, it's got something called Nissl bodies, and they're rough endoplasmic reticulum. They call them Nissl bodies, and it's the way that they stain, the way they kind of look. They were discovered by a scientist named Nissl, but it's really rough endoplasmic reticulum. Okay, and then we have something called neurofibrils. They're intermediate filaments that maintain the cell shape. And these are kind of like microtubules, microfilaments, and they help to maintain the shape of the cell. Okay, and this is kind of, here you can see we've seen this picture before. Okay, so here you can see the cell body. Here's the large nucleus, the nucleolus. Here's all the organelles that you see, lots of mitochondria, smooth endoplasmic reticulum, rough endoplasmic reticulum. And then all of these little extensions that are coming off the cell body here are called dendrocytes. And then usually you have the one long tail that's coming off. This is called the axon. Okay, it is surrounded by these what we call the Schwann cells. These are just fat insulating cells. They allow nerve impulses to be transmitted quicker. Okay, they kind of help to insulate the axon. And then at the very end you have the axon terminals. Okay, these are where they're going to connect either to a muscle or a gland, and then they're going to transmit a signal to that particular cell. They can actually also attach to another nerve cell. Okay, so it can be another nerve cell, it can be a muscle, or a gland can be here at the end of the cell. And you can kind of see here's a good microscopic picture. We've seen these in lab. We'll look at them again in lab under the microscope. Okay, usually they're stained purple in the microscope. Okay, but the processes that hang off, okay, the dendrocytes conduct impulses towards the cell body. Neurons can have hundreds of them, and you can kind of see that here. Okay, so you can, if you look at the arrows, you can kind of follow the arrows. You can see that, you know, nerve impulses are going to come in this direction. So they actually come in through the dendrocytes this way. Okay, so the nerve impulses are going to come this way, and then they actually leave this direction, and they're going to go out the axon, and that's what these arrows are showing you. And this is the direction of nerve impulses. Okay, so dendrocytes bring in the information, you know, so they conduct it towards the cell body, where then it can get processed. Okay, axons conduct impulses away, so think axon and away. They conduct signals away from the cell body. Neurons have only one axon arising from the cell body, and where the axon leaves the cell body is called the axon hillock. And if you look at here, you can see that. Here's the axon hillock. This is where the cell body kind of starts to taper, and it'll form the axon, and that's what we call the axon hillock. Okay, so you can see how it has one tail, one axon, but it's got lots of different dendrites there. Okay, all right. Neurons have only one. Okay, they end at axon terminals, which contain vesicles with neurotransmitters. We've already talked about this. Remember, these vesicles have, we talked about the vesicles had acetylcholine in them. Okay, and that's what's at the axon terminals. Okay, the axon terminals are separated from the next neuron by a gap, and we call that what kind of gap? Okay, so that's what we call the synaptic cleft. Okay, so that's that gap that's between one neuron and another neuron, or a neuron and a muscle, or a neuron and a nerve. It's called the synaptic cleft, and it's that gap that's between the axon terminal and then the next cell. And that next cell could be another neuron, it could be a muscle, it could be a gland. Okay, so the synaptic cleft is the gap, there we go, between the axon terminal and the next neuron. A synapse is a functional junction between nerves where a nerve impulse is transmitted. And a synapse doesn't necessarily need to be between another nerve. It could be between a muscle, or it could be between a gland. Okay, a synapse is just where two cells come together and they meet each other. Okay, and they have between the synaptic cleft, or the gap. Okay, the myelin sheath is interesting too. Okay, so we saw that here. Here's the myelin sheath right here. Okay, it's this little covering. It looks like a jelly roll. It's just kind of wraps itself around the axon. Okay, but it is kind of white, fatty material. It covers axons, and it helps to protect and insulate the fibers, and it helps to speed up nerve impulse transmission. Okay, because it's insulated, the nerve impulse transmission is not lost. Okay, it is able to be shunted in one direction, and so it helps to speed up nerve impulse transmission. Okay, and we'll look at that when we talk a little bit more about nerve impulse transmission. Okay. But these myelin sheaths, Schwann cells are found in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, in the central nervous system, they're made by those oligodendrocytes. They produce myelin sheaths, and they're found in the central nervous system. So they're a little different in terms of how they're named. One's in peripheral nervous system, one's in central nervous system. Okay, but they have something called nodes of Ranvier. These nodes of Ranvier in the peripheral nervous system are these guys right here. They're the little areas right here. Do you see there's a little exposed area here? That is called a node of Ranvier. And what happens is that the nerve impulse actually jumps. It can move faster because it can actually jump over like this. Okay, and so it doesn't have to go all the way down the axon. It can actually jump from one node to another, and it helps to speed up nerve impulse transmission. Okay, and that's what a node of Ranvier. It's named after, again, the scientist that discovered it. Okay. Let's see, where were we? I think this is where we were, right? Yep. Okay. So I think I got through all of that. So here you can kind of see. It's interesting how this works. These cells secrete this kind of fatty tissue, and it kind of wraps itself around almost like a jelly roll. It can be wrapped around like 100 times, but it helps to insulate the axon. Okay, but it kind of wraps itself around and so forth, and that's called what we call the myelin sheath. It's made up of adipose, like kind of fat tissue. Okay, so just some terminology that we need to look at. Okay, we're going to talk a lot about this terminology, so I want to just mention it now. Okay. When you have something called a nuclei, okay, we've heard nuclei before. You've heard of nuclei in a cell. When we talk about nuclei in the central nervous system, we're talking about a cluster of cell bodies, okay? So when you have a whole bunch of cell bodies together, so, you know, here's a cell body, here's a cell body, here's a cell body, here is a cell body, okay? When you have a whole bunch of cell bodies clustered together, that is called a nuclei. Okay, so all of this is called a nuclei. Okay, you have a nuclei of a cell, you have a nuclei of an atom, and now you have a nuclei of the central nervous system. A nuclei of the central nervous system is just a cluster of cell bodies. It's a whole bunch of cell bodies just kind of bound together. Okay, and that's what we call a nuclei. Okay, when you have a cluster of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system, in the peripheral nervous system, we call that a ganglia, and I mentioned that before. Okay, a ganglia is found here. Where's that one picture? Here. Here, see these little bulges right here? That's called a ganglia, and what's found in there are clusters of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. They're just a bunch of the little cell bodies with the nuclei, and they kind of cluster together, and that's called a ganglia. Okay, so in the central nervous system, it's called a nuclei. In the central nervous system, it's called a ganglia. Okay. All right. So clusters of cell bodies in the central nervous system is a nuclei. Clusters of, or collections of cell bodies, clusters of them, that are outside the central nervous system in the peripheral nervous is called a ganglia. Okay. Now, in the central nervous system, okay, bundles of nerve fibers, okay, so they're called tracts. So when you take this cluster of cell bodies and then you have all of these little extensions, all of their axons are clustered together, that's called a tract, okay? And we'll look at the optic tract that's coming off of the optic nerve. We'll look at that tract, okay? So when you have these clusters of axons in the central nervous system, it's called a tract. When you have clusters of axons in the peripheral nervous system, it's called a nerve. Okay, so I know this is kind of, so they give different terms of the same thing, whether it's in the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system, they call them different things. Okay, so a nuclei is cell bodies in the central nervous system. A ganglia is cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. A tract is a whole bunch of axons in the central nervous system, whereas a whole bunch of axons in the peripheral nervous system is called a nerve. Okay, so when we talk about the sciatic nerve and the ulnar nerve, those are just long extensions of axons. They're just clusters of axons bound together, okay? And that's what we call a nerve, and that's in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, white matter, you probably have heard of gray matter and white matter, like in those CSI and all those crime shows that say, oh, there was gray matter all over the road. Okay, gray matter and white matter are just collections of fibers that either have myelin or they don't. Okay, they're either surrounded by Schwann cells or not. Okay, if they have myelin around them, they look kind of white, so they call it white matter. If they don't have myelin around them, they look gray, and so it kind of it's what we call gray matter, okay? So white matter and gray matter are just the type of nerve tissue, whether it has myelin around it or not. If it has myelin around it, it's called white matter. If it does not have white matter, or it does not have myelin around it, it's called gray matter, okay? So mostly unmyelinated fibers and cell bodies, okay? That's called gray matter. You'll find a lot gray matter a lot in the brain, which is why they'll say, oh, there's gray matter all over the road, meaning that there's brain tissue all over the road, okay? Now, when we look at kind of a functional classification, okay, we have to look at what we call the sensory or the afferent neurons, okay? They carry impulses from the sensory receptors to the central nervous system, okay? Receptors are things found cutaneously, found in the skin. They detect pain, temperature, touch, pressure. We also have things called proprioceptors. They're found in muscles and tendons, and they detect stretch. So if the muscle's being stretched or not. They help also muscles kind of find their place in space. Proprioceptors are really good, like when you're jumping, so that you land on your 2 feet and you don't land with your ankles inward where you might sprain your ankle, okay? Proprioceptors help you to allow your joints to know their place in space, like especially when you're walking, you're jumping, so that you land correctly, okay, that you don't hurt yourself. And that's what proprioceptors help do, okay? And a lot of times those proprioceptors help you to detect how much stretch there is in a muscle, okay? But again, like I said, they help you to find your place in space, especially in joints, okay? So I wanted to kind of show you this too. So if you look at this, here is an interesting cross section. This right here is the spinal cord. If I were to make a transverse cut across the spinal cord, this is what it would look like, okay? It would look like, it almost has like a butterfly shape inside, and we'll talk about what this is. This is the dorsal root, and you have a ventral root, okay? So this, if you look, let me label it for you, okay? So looking at this particular spinal cord here, okay, this is the posterior side. So this is the back of the spinal cord. This is the anterior side. This is the front of the spinal cord, okay? So any of the blue here, okay, this is afferent. So this is going to be what's collecting information. So this is going to be sensory, okay? So all the sensory input comes in and it goes through the back of the spinal cord like this, okay? And so here is a cell body. So a whole bunch of these cell bodies located right here in the peripheral nervous system is called a ganglion, and it makes this kind of like bulge right here. It'll make kind of a bulging, because you're gonna have a whole bunch of little cell bodies in here. Okay, a whole cluster, remember a whole cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system was called a ganglion, okay? This is going to be a sensory neuron in that it's bringing information to the central nervous system, okay? So it's going to come from skin, it's going to come from the nose, it could come from the eyes, it could come from the ears, okay? So it's bringing information into, towards the central nervous system, okay? All right, then you have something, a really interesting structure right here. This little guy we have not talked about. This is called an interneuron. An interneuron is a nerve cell that processes the information. So it's going to take it from a sensory neuron, it's going to integrate it, hence interneuron, and it can send it up to the brain, or if it's a reflex, it'll process it right here in the spinal cord so it can have a really quick response. And then it goes out through a motor neuron. Motor neurons come off the front of the spinal cord, and they're going to go out like this, and eventually they meet in a nerve. This is actually right here is going to be a nerve, because remember, a nerve is a collection of axons. So here's an axon from the sensory, here's an axon from the motor, and when you have a collection of them, you get what we call a nerve, okay? And that's going to go out, and now you're going to have, it's going to go to an effector, which is muscle and glands, okay? These are coming from receptors, and this is going out to effectors, Okay, so this is kind of how the functional classification, where you're getting the functional classification, where you've got kind of this sensory neuron. It gets integrated through an interneuron, and it goes out through a motor neuron, or what we call an effector neuron. Okay, so it comes in, processed in the spinal cord, and goes out. Okay, all right. So all the sensory are kind of in the back of the spinal cord. All the motor are kind of in the front of the spinal cord. Okay. And when we look in lab, we'll look at more of this structure when we look at it in lab. Okay, and just to kind of show you some types of sensory receptors. Okay, so here you've got, okay, so free nerve endings. So this would be found in the skin. Oh, you've just cut yourself. Okay, so they can detect pain. This is going to be what we call a nociceptor. Nociceptors is a specialized type of nerve cell that can detect pain. Okay, and allows you to know that you've done something harmful to yourself. Okay, because it's very painful. Okay, temperature receptors are also can be this way, because sometimes if something's too hot or too cold, it's painful. Okay, here's another one. You have something called Meissner corpuscles. They are touch receptors. They can feel pressure, light pressure. Meissner corpuscles can kind of feel light pressure. Okay, so that would be an example of another one. Okay, lamellar corpuscles can feel deep pressure. Okay, those are the one that look like the onion when you looked at in the skin. They look like like a peeled onion. Lamellar corpuscles feel deep pressure. Okay, or sometimes I think we call them lamellated or lamellated in the skin chapter. Okay, so that kind of look like those onions, but they're found deeper in the dermis, and they can detect deep pressure. Okay, and then you have also something called a Golgi tendon organ. These are what we call proprioceptors. They can feel stretch when the muscle is stretched. Again, they allow you to have your joint maintain its proper position so that you don't hurt yourself. Okay, so they can detect kind of where you are in terms of your plane of space, so that you don't bend or twist or overstretch something, and then you obviously will start. Then you'll hurt your tendon. You can tear a tendon or tear a ligament. So they help you to be able to stop hyperextension before you really hurt yourself. Okay, because it starts to become very painful. Okay, again, another one is when it's attached. So this one is attached to like a tendon. Okay, when you're overstretching a tendon. And then you also have one that's kind of what we call a muscle spindle. It's also another type of proprioceptor that's attached to actual muscle, so you don't overstretch a muscle and end up tearing it. Okay, so those are different types of sensory receptors. Okay, then we have the motor receptors. Again, they carry impulses from the central nervous system to viscera, which are internal organs, and then muscles and glands. Okay, we also have those interneurons I mentioned before. They are found in the central nervous system, and they are the ones that actually connect. So here, these guys right here, they connect sensory to motor. Okay, and those are called interneurons. Okay, so you'll see those here. They're in gray. They're found in the central nervous system. They can be found in the brain. They're called interneurons. So they integrate the responses, bring in information from the sensory neuron. It's integrated, and then some kind of output is sent to a motor neuron. Okay? All right? And that's what an interneuron does. And there's that picture again. Okay? And we are done with part A.